In the silent bond, Jack Harrison, a former Special Forces operative, stumbles upon Shadow, a military-trained dog abandoned in the snowy woods. Shadow leads Jack to uncover the whereabouts of his former comrade, Ethan Cole, who is on the run after discovering damning evidence of betrayal during their last mission. As Jack and Ethan reunite, they face relentless mercenaries determined to retrieve the notebook holding Ethan's findings. Through perilous battles and heartfelt moments, the story explores loyalty, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog. What do you think about the silent bond? Does Jack's journey resonate with you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, DG Story, to enjoy more thrilling and emotional tales like this one. Your feedback inspires us to create even better stories. The winter morning was bitterly cold, with a heavy frost blanketing the trees in a shimmering white coat. Jack Harrison pulled his scarf tighter around his neck as he trudged through the dense forest in northern Montana. The snow crunched under his boots, each step a reminder of the isolation he sought. Jack, a former Special Forces operative, had retreated to this remote corner of the country to escape the memories of war that still haunted him. Hunting had become his therapy, a quiet, solitary activity that required focus and patience, leaving little room for his past demons to resurface. That morning, however, something felt different. As Jack followed fresh deer tracks weaving through the trees, a faint noise cut through the silence. He stopped abruptly, holding his breath to listen. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a low, guttural whimper carried on the cold wind. "What the hell?" Jack muttered under his breath, his sharp instincts kicking in. The sound came again, more distinct this time, and he turned off the trail toward it. Pushing through a thicket of bare branches, Jack's breath caught in his throat. Tied to the base of a massive oak tree was a dog. The animal was a Belgian Malinois, its tan coat matted with dirt and patches of dried blood. Its ribs were visible, and its eyes held a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. A frayed rope bound its neck to the tree trunk, and the bark around it was scratched and scarred as though the dog had tried desperately to free itself. Jack knelt slowly, his movements deliberate to avoid startling the animal. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his voice steady and calm. "What's a guy like you doing out here?" The dog let out a low growl but didn't move, his body rigid with fear. As Jack observed it, something metallic around the dog's neck caught his eye. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a knife, and cut the rope carefully. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered. As the tension in the rope released, the dog stayed in place but tilted its head slightly, watching him with intelligent eyes. Jack took a closer look at the object dangling from its collar, a military dog tag. His heart stopped for a moment as he read the engraved name, Ethan Cole. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan Cole wasn't just anyone. He had been Jack's squadmate during his last deployment, a man he trusted with his life. Memories flooded Jack's mind, missions in hostile territories, long nights spent strategizing, and Ethan's easy laughter cutting through the tension. But their last mission together had gone horribly wrong, leaving both physical and emotional scars that neither man had spoken of since. Jack stared at the dog tag, his hands trembling slightly. He had heard rumors about Ethan after they returned stateside, how he had withdrawn from everyone, disappearing into the wilderness. But Jack had never expected to stumble across a piece of Ethan's world out here in the middle of nowhere. "Shadow," Jack murmured, trying the name out as he met the dog's gaze. The dog's ears perked up slightly, his tail giving a hesitant wag. "So, you're his partner." "Ha!" Jack pulled out a water bottle from his pack and poured some into his cupped hand, offering it to the dog. Shadow hesitated but eventually leaned forward to drink. "That's it, buddy. You're safe now," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. The Shadow drank. Jack's mind raced. Why was the dog here, tied up and abandoned? And more importantly, where was Ethan? The snow around the tree bore signs of recent activity, boot prints and scattered cigarette butts. Someone had been here, but they were long gone now. Jack scanned the area, noting the disturbed snow leading deeper into the forest. He looked back at Shadow, who was now watching him intently. "I guess you and I have some work to do," he said, standing and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Shadow stood shakily, his legs trembling from weakness but still holding steady. Jack adjusted his pack and started following the tracks, the dog limping beside him. The forest seemed eerily quiet now, the faint rustle of wind in the trees the only sound. Jack's thoughts turned inward as he pieced together what little he knew. Ethan had always been the rock of their team, the one who kept everyone grounded no matter how dire the situation. What could have driven him to leave behind a dog like Shadow? Jack glanced down at the dog, whose focus never wavered as they walked. "Don't worry, Shadow," he muttered. "We're going to find him, whatever it takes." As they moved deeper into the woods, the snow began to fall again, light flakes swirling in the air like a silent promise of challenges ahead. The cabin stood in the middle of a snowy clearing, its wooden frame leaning slightly under the weight of age and neglect. Jack approached cautiously, his breath visible in the icy air. Shadow followed at his side, his steps steady but wary. The tracks they had been following led directly to the cabin. The cigarette butts and faint boot prints near the oak tree now made sense. Someone had been here, and recently. As Jack studied the area, a strange unease settled in his chest. He stepped onto the rickety porch, noting the broken slats beneath his boots. The door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. Jack glanced at Shadow, who stood still, ears perked and nose twitching. "Stay close," Jack muttered as he nudged the door open with his foot. The inside of the cabin was as desolate as the outside. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, its paint peeling and legs unsteady. A small table was cluttered with empty cans, crumpled papers, and a nearly burnt-out candle. The smell of damp wood and stale tobacco lingered in the air. Jack's eyes landed on a stack of papers on the table. He reached for them cautiously, flipping through scribbled notes and crude sketches. One paper caught his attention. It was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding forest. Several locations were marked with X's, including the spot where he had found Shadow. "What is this?" Jack murmured, tracing the lines on the map. Shadow let out a low whine, drawing Jack's attention to the corner of the room. There, nestled against the wall, was a makeshift bed, a worn sleeping bag with patches of dirt and snow. A half-empty pack of cigarettes and a water bottle sat nearby. Jack crouched down and examined the items. The brand of cigarettes matched the butts he had found earlier. He picked up the water bottle, shaking it slightly. It was still half full, the liquid inside unfrozen. Whoever had been here couldn't have left more than a day ago. "Ethan," Jack whispered, the name heavy on his tongue. Shadow padded over to the sleeping bag, sniffing it cautiously before looking back at Jack with expectant eyes. Jack felt a knot tighten in his chest. Ethan had been here, but the chaotic state of the cabin and the notes scattered around told a story of a man who was struggling. Jack glanced at a nearby shelf lined with a few battered books and a photograph in a cracked frame. The photo stopped him cold. It was a picture of their unit, taken during their last deployment. Ethan stood in the middle, his arm slung around Jack's shoulder, both of them smiling despite the harsh desert backdrop. Jack's fingers tightened around the frame as the memories surged back. Memories of missions gone wrong, lives lost, and the haunting weight of survival. Shadow barked suddenly, his ears swiveling toward the window. Jack tensed, instinctively reaching for the pistol holstered at his side. "Easy, boy," he whispered, moving toward the window. The forest outside was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But Jack's sharp eyes caught something, a faint trail of smoke curling upward in the distance, barely visible against the gray sky. "Looks like we're not alone," Jack muttered, turning back to Shadow. He grabbed the map from the table, folding it neatly and tucking it into his jacket. Before leaving, he scanned the cabin one last time, taking in every detail. He noted the way the sleeping bag was positioned, the alignment of the scattered items, and the faint scratches on the floorboards. It all pointed to one conclusion. Ethan was on the move, but he wasn't running aimlessly. Shadow followed Jack as he stepped back into the cold, their breaths mingling in the icy air. Jack's mind raced as he pieced together the clues. Ethan was clearly tracking something or someone, but why? And why leave Shadow behind? Jack glanced down at the dog, who walked beside him with quiet determination. "I don't know what kind of trouble Ethan's gotten himself into," he said, more to himself than to Shadow. "But we're going to figure it out." The smoke in the distance grew more distinct as they trudged through the forest. Jack felt his adrenaline spike, his senses sharpening as they neared what looked like another campsite. The remains of a fire smoldered in a ring of stones, and scattered around it were the unmistakable signs of a recent presence. Footprints, a discarded canteen, and a torn piece of fabric. Shadow sniffed at the fabric, letting out a low growl. Jack crouched beside him, studying the footprints. They were deeper than the ones at the cabin, suggesting someone had been moving quickly, perhaps in a hurry to leave. Jack's gaze swept the area, his hunter's instincts on high alert. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. He scanned the tree line, his hand hovering near his pistol. A sudden rustle to his right made him freeze. Shadow growled again, his stance tense and ready. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice steady but firm. The response was silence, followed by the faint crunch of snow underfoot. Jack rose slowly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. Shadow took a step forward, his body language signaling the presence of someone or something nearby. "Show yourself," Jack demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The silence stretched thin, the tension in the air almost palpable. Then, from behind a cluster of trees, a figure emerged. The figure stepped out from behind the trees, shrouded in a thick, weathered coat and a hood pulled low over their face. Jack tightened his grip on his pistol, keeping it holstered for now but ready to draw if necessary. Shadow stood rigid at his side, his growl low and menacing. "Easy there," Jack said softly, addressing both Shadow and the stranger. "We're not looking for trouble." The figure stopped a few yards away, their hands raised slightly, a universal sign of peace. Slowly, they pulled back their hood, revealing a man's face, rough and weathered by the elements. His dark eyes darted nervously between Jack and Shadow. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice firm but calm. The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on Shadow for a moment before shifting back to Jack. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his tone cautious. "You don't look like you belong out here." Jack took a step forward, keeping his movements deliberate. "Name's Jack Harrison. I found this dog, Shadow, tied to a tree back that way." He gestured vaguely toward the forest behind him. "I'm looking for his owner, Ethan Cole. Know him?" The man's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he masked it. "Can't say I do," he said, a little too quickly. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that?" The man didn't respond immediately, his hands lowering slightly as his posture tensed. Jack noticed the slight shift in weight, the way the man's fingers twitched as if ready to reach for something. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Jack said, his tone steady but edged with authority. "But I need answers, and if you know anything about Ethan, now's the time to talk." The man sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "I don't know much, but I've seen him. A few days ago, he came through here, looked like hell gaunt, paranoid, like he hadn't slept in weeks." Jack's heart tightened. Did he say anything? Where he was going? The man hesitated again, glancing at Shadow before answering. "He didn't say much, just asked about the old fire tower up on Wolf Ridge." I told him it's been abandoned for years, but he didn't care, just kept muttering about needing to finish something. Jack nodded slowly, processing the information. Wolf Ridge was a steep climb, especially in winter, but it wasn't far from their current location. Thanks, Jack said, his tone curt. The man raised an eyebrow. You planning on going up there? Jack didn't answer directly. You said he looked paranoid. Did he seem dangerous? The man's lips pressed into a thin line. Dangerous? No. Desperate? Absolutely. Like a man running from something he can't outrun. Jack exchanged a glance with Shadow, who had relaxed slightly but still watched the stranger with a wary eye. Appreciate the help, Jack said, his voice firm but final. The man nodded and stepped back into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. Jack waited a moment, ensuring the man was gone, before turning his attention back to Shadow. Wolf Ridge, he murmured. That's where we're headed. The climb to Wolf Ridge was grueling, the snow deepening with each step. Shadow trudged beside Jack, his pace steady despite the cold. The forest grew denser as they ascended, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Jack's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of information. Ethan's paranoia, his desperate state, the abandoned fire tower, it all painted a troubling picture. And yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something lurking beneath the surface. As they neared the ridge, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and cutting through Jack's heavy coat. He pulled his scarf higher, squinting against the biting cold. Finally, the fire tower came into view, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the gray sky. The structure was rusted and weathered, its stairs winding precariously upward. Jack stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the area for any signs of life. Stay close, Shadow, he murmured, his hand resting lightly on the dog's head. The tower appeared abandoned, its windows shattered and the surrounding ground undisturbed. But Jack's instincts told him otherwise. He approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the snow. At the base of the tower, he found fresh tracks leading upward. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't bothered to cover their trail. Jack's pulse quickened as he began his ascent, Shadow following close behind. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step an anxious reminder of the tower's age. As they reached the top, Jack paused, listening intently. A faint noise came from inside the enclosed cabin, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Jack pushed the door open slowly, his pistol drawn. Inside, the air was stale, and the room was dimly lit by the gray light filtering through the cracked windows. Ethan sat in the corner, his back against the wall and his knees drawn to his chest. His once strong frame was gaunt, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. He held a small notebook in his hands, his fingers tapping against it absently. Ethan, Jack said softly, lowering his weapon. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and recognition. Jack? He croaked, his voice hoarse. It's me, Jack said, stepping closer. I found Shadow. He led me here. At the sound of his name, Shadow stepped forward, his tail wagging hesitantly. Ethan's expression crumbled, and he dropped the notebook, reaching out to the dog. Shadow, he whispered, his voice breaking. The dog closed the distance, nuzzling against Ethan's outstretched hand. Jack watched silently, the weight of the moment settling over him. You've got some explaining to do, Jack said gently, crouching down beside Ethan. Ethan nodded, his hand trembling as it rested on Shadow's head. I know, he said, his voice barely audible. But first, you need to understand what I've been running from. The wind howled through the broken windows of the fire tower as Jack crouched beside Ethan. Shadow sat quietly, leaning into Ethan's trembling hand, his presence a steadying force. For a long moment, the three of them sat in silence, the weight of the unspoken filling the room. Ethan broke the quiet first, his voice raw and uneven. I thought I was protecting him, Jack. I thought leaving him behind would keep him safe. Jack studied his old friend carefully. Ethan's face, once full of confidence and resolve, was now marked by lines of fear and fatigue. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes darted around the room as though expecting danger to burst in at any moment. "Ethan," Jack began, keeping his tone calm but firm. "You need to tell me what's going on. Why did I find Shadow tied to a tree? Why are you out here, running like this?" Ethan let out a shaky breath and leaned back against the wall, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It's all connected to that last mission," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack's stomach tightened. He didn't need to ask which mission Ethan meant. It was the one that had haunted them both, the ambush that had claimed half their unit. "After we got back," Ethan continued, his hands clutching at the edges of the notebook, "I started looking into things, trying to figure out how it all went so wrong. The deeper I dug, the more I realized it wasn't just bad luck. Someone sold us out, Jack. Someone on the inside." Jack froze, the words sinking in like a stone in deep water. The possibility had crossed his mind before, but he had always pushed it aside, unwilling to confront the implications. "You're sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice low. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I found evidence, communications logs, reports that didn't add up. Someone fed intel to the enemy, and our team paid the price." Jack ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "If that's true, why didn't you bring it to the higher-ups? Let them deal with it?" Ethan's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and despair. "I tried, Jack, but every time I got close to someone who could help, something happened. They'd get reassigned, shut down my questions, or suddenly stop talking to me altogether. It was like hitting a wall over and over." Jack frowned. "So, you came out here? What's the plan? Ethan, you can't just run forever." Ethan pulled the notebook closer to his chest. "I thought, if I could piece everything together, find proof that couldn't be ignored, I could expose whoever's behind this. But they found out, Jack. They're watching me, tracking me. That's why I had to leave Shadow behind. They were getting too close, and I couldn't risk him getting hurt." The room fell silent again as Jack absorbed Ethan's words. Shadow shifted, resting his head on Ethan's knee, a quiet reminder of loyalty and trust. "I saw the tracks near your cabin," Jack said finally, "and the smoke from a campsite nearby. You think it's them?" Ethan nodded. "They've been on my tail for weeks. I barely made it to this tower without them catching up." Jack exhaled slowly, his hunter's instincts sharpening. "Then we don't have much time. If they've been tracking you this far, they'll find us soon." The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Jack and Ethan worked together, their old camaraderie flickering to life as they fortified the fire tower. They set traps along the trail leading up the ridge, using what little materials they had to create an early warning system. Ethan showed Jack the contents of his notebook, pages filled with detailed notes, copied reports, and rough sketches of troop movements from their last mission. As Jack studied the information, he began to see the pattern Ethan had uncovered. It wasn't just a random ambush. The enemy had known exactly where they would be and when, down to the minute. "This is solid," Jack admitted, closing the notebook. "If we can get this to someone trustworthy, it could blow the whole thing wide open." Ethan gave a weak smile. "That's the hard part, isn't it? Finding someone to trust." Jack nodded, glancing out the window at the darkening forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The fire tower creaked under the weight of the wind, a sound that only added to the tension. Shadow stood near the door, his ears pricked and his body alert. Jack followed the dog's gaze, scanning the treeline below. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but then, just at the edge of the clearing, a flicker of movement caught his eye. "They're here," Jack muttered, his hand instinctively going to his pistol. Ethan moved to the window, his expression tightening as he spotted the figures emerging from the forest. There were at least 3 of them, dressed in dark clothing and moving with the precision of trained operatives. "They won't stop, Jack," Ethan said quietly. "Not until I'm dead. Then we make sure that doesn't happen," Jack replied, his voice steady. He turned to Shadow, who was already at attention. "Stay close, boy. We're going to need you." As the first of the intruders approached the base of the tower, Jack's pulse quickened. The traps they had set worked as intended, triggering loud snaps and sending small avalanches of snow down the slope. But the intruders were undeterred, their movements swift and calculated. "Get ready," Jack said, positioning himself near the door with his pistol drawn. Ethan stood beside him, clutching a makeshift weapon, a metal pipe they had scavenged from the tower. Shadow growled low, his body tense and ready. The fire tower had become their battleground, a fragile stronghold against the shadows closing in. The first clash came suddenly, a burst of sound shattering the tense silence. The intruders were methodical, using the terrain to their advantage as they advanced on the fire tower. Jack's heart pounded as he and Ethan held their positions, Shadow growling low at their side. "They're testing us," Jack muttered, his eyes fixed on the figures moving through the trees below. "Trying to see what we've got." Ethan nodded, gripping the metal pipe tightly. His face was pale but set with determination. "They're not getting this," he said, gesturing toward the notebook lying on the floor beside him. Jack glanced at the notebook, its pages a potential death warrant if it fell into the wrong hands. "We'll make sure of it," he said, his voice steady. A loud snap echoed from below as one of their traps triggered, sending a makeshift barrier of logs tumbling down the slope. The intruders scattered, their dark silhouettes darting between the trees. Jack took the opportunity to fire a warning shot, the crack of his pistol cutting through the air. "That should slow them down," he said, reloading quickly. But the reprieve was short-lived. A second later, a flash of light burst from the treeline, a flare, casting an eerie red glow over the snow-covered ground. It was a signal, and Jack knew what it meant. "They're coordinating," he said grimly. "This isn't just a few guys looking to scare us off. They're organized." Ethan swallowed hard. "How long do you think we can hold them?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Shadow, who was pacing near the door, his body tense and ready. The dog's instincts were razor-sharp, and Jack trusted him implicitly. "Shadow," Jack said, crouching to meet the dog's eyes. "Stay close to Ethan. Protect him." Shadow barked softly, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Another noise drew Jack's attention, a muffled shout from below, followed by the sound of boots crunching through snow. The intruders were advancing again, this time more cautiously, their movements deliberate. "They're coming," Jack said, rising to his feet. The first intruder reached the base of the tower moments later, their dark figure blending into the shadows. Jack watched as they tested the structure, their hand brushing against the icy metal supports. Jack fired a warning shot, the bullet striking the ground near the intruder's feet. "Back off," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. The intruder didn't flinch. Instead, they raised a hand, signaling to someone behind them. A second later, another figure appeared, this one carrying a rifle slung across their back. Jack's jaw tightened. "They're not playing around," he muttered. Ethan moved to the window, his hands trembling as he peered outside. "There's more of them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack followed his gaze. 3 more intruders had emerged from the treeline, their weapons gleaming in the flare's red light. They spread out, surrounding the tower in a loose formation. "We're pinned," Ethan said, his breath quickening. "Not yet," Jack replied. He scanned the room, his mind racing. The tower's height gave them an advantage, but it was also a trap. If the intruders decided to set fire to the structure, they'd have no way out. "We need to make a move," Jack said, his tone decisive. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." Ethan looked at him, panic flashing in his eyes. "Where are we supposed to go? They've got us surrounded." Jack grabbed the notebook from the floor and stuffed it into his jacket. There's a clearing about half a mile east of here. If we can make it there, we'll have more cover. Ethan hesitated. And if they follow us? Jack glanced at Shadow, who stood alert and ready. Then we lead them on a chase. Divide their attention. Buy ourselves some time. Ethan swallowed hard but nodded. All right, let's do it. The escape was a blur of movement and noise. Jack led the way, Shadow at his heels, as they slipped out of the tower and into the forest. The intruders reacted immediately, their shouts echoing through the trees as they gave chase. Jack's training kicked in, his movements precise and calculated. He led Ethan and Shadow through the thick underbrush, weaving between trees and using the terrain to their advantage. The snow muffled their steps, but the red glow of the flare still lit the forest, making it harder to stay hidden. They're gaining on us, Ethan called out, his voice strained. Keep moving, Jack shouted back. A gunshot rang out, the sound startlingly close. Jack ducked instinctively, his heart pounding. He turned to see Shadow barking furiously, his body positioned protectively in front of Ethan. We need to split up, Jack said, his mind working quickly. He handed the notebook to Ethan. Take this and head east. Stick to the trees. Shadow will go with you. What about you? Ethan asked, his voice filled with worry. Jack gave him a tight smile. I'll draw them off. Meet me at the clearing. Ethan hesitated, his grip tightening on the notebook. Jack, go, Jack barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan nodded reluctantly and turned, disappearing into the trees with Shadow at his side. Jack watched them go, relief flooding through him as he saw Shadow keeping pace. Then he turned back toward the sound of their pursuers, his pistol ready. Come on, you bastards, he muttered under his breath. The next few minutes were a chaotic dance of evasion and pursuit. Jack led the intruders deeper into the forest, using every trick he knew to stay ahead. He fired occasional shots to keep their attention, his movements deliberate and calculated. By the time he reached the clearing, his breath was ragged, and his body ached from the effort. He scanned the area, his heart lifting as he saw Ethan and Shadow waiting near the edge of the treeline. You made it, Jack said, his voice heavy with relief. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. But they're still coming. Jack turned, his jaw tightening as he heard the distant shouts of their pursuers. Then we make our stand here, he said. Shadow growled softly, his body tense as he stood between Jack and Ethan. The dog's loyalty was unshakable, a beacon of strength in the chaos. As the first of the intruders appeared at the edge of the clearing, Jack raised his pistol, his resolve hardening. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but they weren't going down without a fight. The clearing became a battlefield as the intruders closed in, their dark silhouettes moving with purpose through the snow. Jack, Ethan, and Shadow took defensive positions behind a fallen tree, the thick trunk providing limited cover against the advancing threat. They're spreading out, Jack muttered, his sharp eyes tracking their movements, trying to flank us. Ethan's breathing was uneven, his knuckles white as he gripped the pipe. What do we do, Jack? Jack scanned the area, his mind racing. We hold them here as long as we can. Make every shot count. Shadow crouched low beside them, his eyes fixed on the nearest figure. His growl rumbled through the air, a warning that didn't go unnoticed. The intruders slowed, their movements cautious as they took in the sight of the dog. Stay ready, Jack said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The first shots came from the treeline, a series of sharp cracks that shattered the icy stillness. Jack returned fire, his aim precise as he forced the nearest intruder to dive for cover. Ethan flinched at the sound, but he didn't falter, staying low behind the log. Shadow barked fiercely, his body coiled like a spring. Jack risked a glance at the dog, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and worry. Shadow was a fighter, no doubt about it, but Jack knew they couldn't rely on him to do it all. Ethan, Jack said, keeping his voice low but urgent. "If anything happens, you get that notebook out of here. You hear me?" Ethan looked at him, his eyes wide. "I'm not leaving you behind." Jack's jaw tightened. "This isn't about me. It's about finishing what you started. Promise me." Ethan hesitated, then gave a shaky nod. "Okay, I promise." Another burst of gunfire forced them both to duck, with splintering off the log as bullets struck it. Jack fired back, his movements fluid and practiced. "They're trying to pin us down," he said, his mind racing for a solution. Shadow suddenly bolted forward, darting around the side of the log and into the fray. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. "Shadow! No!" The dog was a blur of motion, his powerful frame weaving through the snow. He lunged at the nearest intruder, knocking them off balance and sending their weapons skidding across the ground. "Damn it!" Jack muttered, rising to provide cover. He fired a warning shot that forced another intruder to retreat, buying Shadow enough time to return to their side. "Good boy," Jack said breathlessly as Shadow crouched beside him again, his fur bristling but his tail wagging slightly. Ethan let out a shaky laugh. "He's fearless." Jack gave a tight smile. "Yeah, but let's not make a habit of that." The battle raged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Jack's pistol was running low on ammo, and Ethan's makeshift weapon offered little reassurance against the well-armed intruders. But despite the odds, they held their ground, using the terrain and their wits to outmaneuver their attackers. At one point, Jack spotted an opportunity. A cluster of the intruders had taken cover behind a boulder, their focus entirely on advancing. Jack motioned to Ethan. "Cover me," he said, his voice firm. Ethan nodded, his hands shaking as he hefted the pipe. Jack darted around the side of the clearing, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. He reached a position behind the intruders, taking them by surprise with a well-placed shot. The group scattered, their formation breaking apart. Jack returned to the fallen tree, his expression grim. "That bought us some time," he said. Ethan exhaled shakily. "How much?" "Not enough," Jack admitted. Shadow let out a low whine, his ears swiveling toward the treeline. Jack followed his gaze and saw another figure emerging, larger and more imposing than the others. The man carried himself with an air of authority, his weapon held with practiced ease. "That's their leader," Jack said, his tone grim. The leader stopped a few yards from the clearing, his cold eyes sweeping over the scene. "Jack Harrison," he called out, his voice deep and steady. "You've put up quite a fight, but it's over. Hand over the notebook, and no one else has to get hurt." Jack clenched his jaw. "You think I'm going to trust you?" he shouted back. The leader chuckled darkly. "Trust has nothing to do with it. You're out of options. Make it easy on yourself." Jack glanced at Ethan, whose face was pale but determined. "Don't listen to him," Ethan said. "I wasn't planning to," Jack replied. The leader raised a hand, signaling his men. "Last chance. Harrison." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he fired a warning shot into the snow at the leader's feet. The man didn't flinch, but his expression hardened. "Have it your way," he said, lowering his hand. The intruders surged forward, their weapons raised. Jack and Ethan braced themselves, Shadow barking furiously as the final confrontation began. The clearing became a whirlwind of movement and sound. Jack moved with calculated precision, his shots finding their marks even as the intruders pressed closer. Ethan swung the pipe with desperate strength, narrowly avoiding a blow from one of the attackers. Shadow was everywhere at once, his speed and agility turning the tide in their favor. He darted between the intruders, snapping at their heels and forcing them to scatter. Despite their efforts, the odds were overwhelming. Jack's pistol clicked empty, and Ethan's exhaustion was evident in his unsteady movements. As the leader advanced, his weapon trained on Jack. A sudden sound cut through the chaos, a distant but distinct wail, growing louder with each passing second. Jack's heart leapt, "Reinforcements," he muttered. The sound of approaching vehicles and shouting voices filled the air, and the leader's men faltered, their confidence wavering. Shadow barked triumphantly as the intruders began to retreat, disappearing into the forest. The leader hesitated, his gaze locking with Jack's for a tense moment before he turned and followed his men. Jack collapsed against the log, his chest heaving. Ethan sank beside him, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. Shadow sat between them, his tail wagging weakly. "We did it," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the tree-line as the first of the reinforcements arrived. "For now," he said, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The reinforcements arrived with blaring sirens and beams of light cutting through the dark forest. Vehicles rolled into the clearing, and a group of heavily armed men disembarked, their movements swift and professional. Jack raised a hand in recognition, relief washing over him as he recognized one of the figures approaching. "Sheriff Taylor," Jack called out, his voice strained but steady. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, jogged over, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "You've had quite the night," Taylor said, his tone dry but laced with concern. "You don't know the half of it," Jack replied, lowering his weapon. Ethan leaned heavily against the fallen tree, clutching the notebook as if it were his lifeline. Shadow sat protectively by his side, his ears swiveling as he tracked the movements of the officers securing the area. "What happened here?" Taylor asked, his gaze shifting between Jack and Ethan. "Ambush," Jack said curtly. "They were after him, and this." He nodded toward the notebook in Ethan's hands. Taylor frowned, motioning for one of his deputies to approach. "Take them to the medic," he said. "We'll handle the scene." "No," Ethan said, his voice shaky but resolute. "This isn't over. Those men will come back. They're not going to stop until they get what they want." Taylor crouched beside him, his expression softening. "Then we need to make sure they don't get it. But first, you need to get patched up. Both of you." Ethan hesitated, his grip on the notebook tightening. Jack placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "He's right," Jack said. "We need to regroup, figure out our next move." Ethan nodded reluctantly, allowing the deputies to help him to one of the waiting vehicles. Shadow followed closely, his presence a constant source of comfort. The makeshift command post was set up in a nearby ranger station, its warm interior a stark contrast to the freezing chaos outside. Jack sat at a worn wooden table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Across from him, Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, his head resting on his paws but his eyes alert. Sheriff Taylor entered the room, a thick folder in his hand. He set it on the table with a heavy thud, his expression grim. "We've identified some of the men who attacked you," he said. Jack straightened, and Taylor opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs and documents. Mercenaries, ex-military, most of them, no official ties, but they're well-funded and well-trained. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. "Of course they are." Taylor's gaze shifted to the notebook sitting on the table between them. "That thing must be worth a fortune for them to go to these lengths." "It's not about money," Ethan said quietly. "It's about secrets, exposing what really happened to our unit." Jack leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What's our play here, Taylor? We can't just sit and wait for them to make their next move." The sheriff sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've contacted some people I trust, federal agents who can take this off our hands and ensure it gets where it needs to go. But they won't be here until morning." Jack exchanged a glance with Ethan. "That gives them plenty of time to try again," he said. Taylor nodded grimly. "That's why we're doubling security. No one's getting in or out without my say-so." As the night wore on, the tension in the station grew palpable. Deputies patrolled the perimeter, their radios crackling with updates. Inside, Jack and Ethan reviewed the contents of the notebook again. searching for anything they might have missed. "It's all here," Ethan said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Names, dates, communications logs, enough to blow the whole thing wide open." Jack studied the pages, his jaw tightening. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted. "If this gets out, it's going to rock a lot of boats." Ethan gave a bitter smile. "That's the point." Shadow suddenly perked up, his ears swiveling toward the door. Jack followed his gaze, his body tensing as he heard a faint noise outside, a rustle too deliberate to be the wind. "Stay here," Jack said, rising from his chair. He grabbed his pistol and moved toward the door, his movements silent and precise. Taylor met him at the threshold, his face grim. "We've got movement on the north side," he said. Jack nodded. "Let's check it out." The two men stepped into the cold night, their breaths visible in the icy air. The forest loomed around them, its dark shadows seeming to shift with every step. "See anything?" Taylor whispered. Jack shook his head. "Not yet, but they're out there." A sudden bark from Shadow inside the station broke the silence, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. "They're here," he said, turning and sprinting back toward the building. Inside, chaos erupted as the intruders launched their assault. Deputies scrambled to return fire, their shouts mingling with the sharp cracks of gunshots. Shadow darted through the fray, his powerful frame a blur of motion as he defended Ethan. Jack burst through the door, his pistol drawn. He spotted Ethan crouched behind a desk, clutching the notebook as Shadow stood protectively in front of him. "Ethan!" Jack shouted, making his way to them. Ethan looked up, his face pale but determined. "They're not stopping." "Jack!" Jack fired at an approaching intruder, his shot finding its mark. "We're getting out of here," he said, grabbing Ethan by the arm. Taylor appeared beside them, his shotgun at the ready. "There's an exit out back," he said. "We'll cover you." Ethan hesitated, his gaze shifting to the chaos around them. "What about the others?" "They'll hold," Taylor said firmly. "Now go." Jack didn't wait for further argument. He pulled Ethan toward the back door, Shadow following closely. The three of them slipped into the night, leaving the battle behind as they disappeared into the dark forest.